Hello, and welcome to the third and final day of our virtual fashion symposium. I am Martha Osterbiel, the Community Engagement Manager at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Like so much of our programming, we had hoped that the fashion symposium could be in person so that we could actually see all of you and tour the Spectrum of Fashion exhibition and give you a peek behind the scenes. While we can't get together in person, we are thrilled that all of our amazing speakers and panelists could join us virtually so that we can still dive into some fashion history together. If you missed either Dr. Jonathan Michael Square's talk on Monday or April Callahan's talk yesterday, we will be posting all the recorded programs online, findable through our new website. Visit us at mdhistory.org to check out our virtual program archive. Another silver lining is that now many of our out-of-state friends and followers are able to tune in. We've become part of a wonderful fashion community across the country and the world, which is why we're so excited to be hosting today's panel discussion with local Baltimore and DC sustainable fashion leaders. It's hard to believe that our Spectrum of Fashion exhibition opened over a year ago. If you haven't been able to see it, it will be up through the end of the year. And if you're not able to visit us, the next best thing is to grab the Spectrum of Fashion catalog from our museum store. It has nearly 100 garments with really stunning detail shots and 4 essays that each take a deep dive into our collection and uncover new stories. We have discounted the catalog for all of you, and I hope you take advantage of that. Now, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Victoria Rose Pass. Welcome, Vicki, and thanks so much for joining us virtually today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Dr. Victoria Pass is a historian, a writer, professor, and specialist in visual culture, particularly in areas of design and fashion. Her research considers the history of fashion culture in the 20th century, but also approaches visual culture as part of a network of visual representations of gender, race, and fashion, for example, that appear in magazines and newspapers, and how they exist in multiple forms and contexts. If you'd like to see this in action, you must follow her on Instagram at Visual Sustenance. She just has she uncovers the most wonderful details, and I highly recommend it. Vicki has received her bachelor's in art history from Boston University, her master's in art history from the Art Institute of Chicago, and her PhD in visual and cultural studies from the University of Rochester. Lastly, but not least, Vicki is a local Baltimorean who does not approve of buying cheap shoes, bakes cupcakes, and can normally be seen wearing a replica vintage 1922 red lipstick on her Zoom meetings. We're so thrilled to welcome her back to our virtual program stage to moderate this panel discussion. And I don't want to take any more time away from this important conversation. So without further ado, Vicki, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me back. I'm really thrilled to be here. So I want to start by introducing the wonderful panelists that have joined us this afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are, wherever this panel finds you in the world, and welcome them to the table. So I'll start with my wonderful colleague, Valeska Populoh. Valeska works as an artist, educator, facilitator, and cultural organizer in her adopted hometown of Baltimore, Maryland. She is a professor in the fibers department at MICA, where she teaches introductory courses in textiles and fiber arts, as well as interdisciplinary and upper level classes focused on puppetry, performing objects, and experimental fashion. For the last 2 years, she was the coordinating faculty for the Natural Dye as Intercultural Connector course that engaged students and community partners in collaborative learning about natural dyes, from studio applications to their complex histories. She has been an active member in the Natural Dye Initiative, exploring the cultural impacts of growing, processing, and using natural dyes in our region. Valeska's own creative practice embraces a wide array of tactics from puppetry, costuming, and participatory performance and cultural organizing, motivated by an interest in healing and repair in our relationships to each other and to the natural world. She is also an affiliated artist with Black Cherry Puppet Theater. Welcome, Valeska. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I'd like to also introduce Caprece Ann Jackson, who is the owner of Bonu Caprece LLC, a strategic marketing, PR, fine arts programming, and event production company established in 2010. Ms. Jackson has produced a myriad of events, PR campaigns, curated installations, and stage production throughout her 35-plus year career. Caprece is the creator and curator of Fashion Comes to Light Collective from 2015 to the present, a performance art production featuring wearable concepts integrated with light technologies and reflective materials. Caprece also founded the Fashion Marketplace at Artscape from 2012 to 2018 and curates fashion-centered events all over Baltimore. Her career highlights include covering the Paris and Milan collections as a Paris-based journalist, staffing the launch team of Elle Magazine's US edition, serving as press secretary for the Baltimore City Council, and producing her first fashion documentary, Anthrop 8, for Sustainable Fashion Week US 2020, funded by the Mica Natural Dye Initiative and the Baltimore Office of Promotion and the Arts. The original Happy I'm Nappy button she developed and marketed nationally from 1986 to 1995 is now on permanent exhibition at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. A permanent exhibit and gift shop exclusive items are presently being developed. Caprece is also an advisor to MICA on the independent fashion community in Baltimore and helped to connect several local designers to the Natural Dye Initiative. Welcome, Caprece. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
And next, I'd love to introduce Janice Wallace. Janice is the owner and creative director of the Fashion Parade. The Fashion Parade is a creative studio focused on helping consumers to build sustainable and ethical lifestyles through closet and wardrobe assessments, identification of unwanted items, and responsible reuse or disposal, as well as home redesign. She's also the co-founder of the DC Sustainable Fashion Collective, DCSFC, which you can find online, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization whose purpose is to foster and educate a community of creative entrepreneurs, lawmakers, activists, academics, and consumers on the importance of sustainability and ethical practices in the fashion industry. Janice is a DC native and a graduate of Howard University with a BA in journalism. Welcome, Janice. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And finally, last but not least, of course, is Alison Tolman. Alison Tolman oversees the museum and library collections at the Maryland Center for History and Culture and is responsible for the preservation, research, access, and maintenance of these collections. Allison also leads the development of dynamic interdepartmental exhibition teams in person and online. Her favorite part of working at MCHC has been developing, preserving, and using the fashion archives to create personal connections to history. Allison joined MCHC in 2014, bringing her years of knowledge and practice in art conservation, as well as advanced study in museum studies. Allison studied art conservation at the University of Delaware and holds an MA in museum studies from Johns Hopkins University. Allison has a deep passion for preserving historical collections. Before joining the MCHC team, she worked for the Smithsonian Institution's Anacostia Community Museum and Museum Conservation Institute. And prior to that, she worked in painting conservation in New Orleans to aid in recovery after Hurricane Katrina. Aside from her love for historical collections, Allison also has a passion for vintage dresses. On weekends, she may be found drinking local craft beer in Frederick, Maryland, where she lives. Welcome, Allison. Thanks so much for joining us. And I want also, just before we engage these amazing minds that we have together around the virtual table, I do want to acknowledge the land that we are all on. I know we're all in different places joining together in this Zoom. I'm coming from Baltimore, and many of our panelists are coming from Baltimore, and of course, the MCHC, the Maryland Center for History and Culture, is there as well. The lands where the Maryland Center for History and Culture are situated are on the traditional ancestral lands of the Piscataway, the Lenape, and the Susquehannock indigenous people. The area today known as Baltimore City, Maryland, has sustained indigenous peoples for more than 12,000 years prior to the arrival of Europeans until the present day. Other American Indian tribal peoples have moved here to Baltimore in diaspora, including the Lumbee people. Only in 2012 were two bands of the Piscataway, the Piscataway Conoy and the Piscataway Indian Nation, recognized by the state of Maryland. And as recently as 2017, did the state also recognize the Acconock Indian tribe. And I wanted to make sure that we recognized these histories, and also that these are vibrant living cultures that are still part of our local community in Baltimore, the broader Maryland community, and of course, the broader community of the United States. So I wanted to start kind of with that history, really, and start us off by thinking about or asking you all to reflect on the ways in which this history, this long history of stewardship of the land and of the earth, extends far further back and is outside of these European and white settler histories that we kind of traditionally often have started fashion histories with. And so I wanted to ask Valeska first if she would reflect on that. And as I'm doing that, I'm going to share some of the images that Valeska has shared with me to give us some beautiful things to look at. So Valeska, thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much to the Maryland Center for History and Culture and to Vicki Pass for all of your work on bringing this panel together in a topic that we could spend 17 hours talking about. I'm grateful to be able to show these images this morning. They are on the left-hand side of Yoruba dancers in Adire cloth in Nigeria, and on the right-hand side, an artisan in Oaxaca, Mexico, wearing a skirt that is dyed with cochinilla, which is a scale insect that is traditionally used in Mexico by the indigenous peoples to dye their cloth. And I think that the title of this slide should actually be Sustainable Fashion, because I think that one of the things that has been really brought to my attention over the last several years is how the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement around sustainability are really interconnected. And I just wanted to briefly read a quote from Dominique Drakeford that helps me sort of guide my work and guide my teaching. Dominique Drakeford is the founder of Sustainable Brooklyn. She works at the intersections of environmental justice and sustainability and design. And she works with Whitney McGuire, who is also a co-founder of Sustainable Brooklyn. And their hope, this is a quote, is to shift Black, Indigenous people of color to the forefront of sustainability. As much of how we discuss fashion and wellness is oftentimes framed from a colonial perspective. And this is a quote from Dominique Drakeford: "Sustainability is the most pressing political issue. We've boxed it into just being about the environment, but the global environmental crisis, including the crisis of fast fashion, has everything to do with civil rights, human rights, Black and Brown, Indigenous liberation. Sustainability is a very holistic political issue." And I know that you will hear that theme repeated by some of our panelists today. And I'll just reflect at some point during the panel. I can maybe speak a little bit more about our work with the Baltimore Natural Dye Initiative at MICA. But part of what we really did is center learning about those histories, learning about the history of colonization and slavery, and how deeply intertwined they are with natural dye and with cloth making, and the structure of the contemporary fashion system. And then the other thing I want to reflect on, again, thanks to my wonderful colleagues in the Baltimore Natural Dye Initiative, including Kibibi Ajanku, is how to center the artistry and the joy of communities, Black and Brown communities around the world, in the textile traditions that they have and the clothing traditions that they have, so that that becomes the center of the story. So thank you, Vicki, for offering me the opportunity to reflect on that as we start today.
Thank you so much for that. And I think, you know, as somebody who teaches fashion history, I think recognizing these very long histories and learning from these pasts and breaking out of the kind of traditional narratives that have for too long excluded Black and Brown communities from these histories is really crucial in understanding how we can move forward in actually creating a more sustainable fashion in the present. Allie, I wanted to ask you too, since your work is in preserving history and is in telling these historical narratives in the museum, if you could talk a little bit about the history of the fashion industry in Baltimore and Maryland, and how we might see connections between that history and these current conversations that we're having about sustainability and waste, labor, the environment, the impact of materials and processing of materials. What stories can we sort of glean from the past?
Sure. I love talking fashion history, so I'm happy to do that. The dress that you see here, one thing that I wanted to bring up is industry as we see it now. This is 19th century industry, but even before then, it was very different. You would buy the fabric and take it to the dressmaker, and you would use every bit of that fabric that you purchased to make dress. And it was assumed that that fabric would last more than a generation. You could give it to your sister, your daughter, a niece. People invested in the textiles a lot more than they invest in clothing now. When they would have ledgers of what they purchased, textiles ranked up there with furniture, and it's sort of shows how clothing has become devalued, I think, a lot over time. This dress, the fabric was made in England in around 1740. And this dress, it has no evidence of any changes. So it was only been made one time. There was no 18th century remade later. This is from the 1840s. So either the dressmaker had a fabric for 100 years, or more likely the family purchased the fabric and then it was saved and passed on as sort of, we would pass on things too in our will to other generations, and then made 100 years later. So it's drastically different than the culture that we see now. But if you want to talk industry, I do have a picture of the garment industry in Baltimore. And I'm going to just give a quick overview of it. But if anyone is really interested in the Baltimore garment industry, I recommend checking out the BMI, that's the Baltimore Museum of Industry. They have a recreation of a garment loft, and they do a wonderful job telling the story of the garment industry. This picture is of the Oppenheim Oberdorf and Co. It's a shirt factory. They did shirt and like athletic underwear. And you can see here all of the women in close quarters working. I mean, these women would be in this room and the windows would have to be closed. Baltimore is a port, so we're burning coal outside. And you have to keep, in the summer, windows closed. We're creating a literal sweatshop. And the majority of people working here are women and immigrants. Again, being a port city, we're big on trade and big on immigration. And so we have a lot of our immigrant population, about 20% in the heyday of the garment industry of Baltimore is in this garment industry. And it leads to a lot of labor issues because the conditions are just deplorable. They're paid by piece, not by hour. So they're really killing themselves to get as much money as they can in really awful conditions. It leads to a lot of labor strikes in the 20th century. And I think that we can all see how that relates today. There have been so many issues that today with sweatshops and with fast fashion, this is the early mass production that we're seeing in this image. And it really reflects on today.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it makes me think about if y'all are interested in following some organizations thinking about these issues right now, the Garment Workers Center out of LA is a great one to give a follow to on Instagram. And they've been engaged in a lot of activism, particularly around garment making in the US and the conditions that the mostly female and mostly immigrant workforce are working under there in LA right now. Particularly as COVID is on the rise. And Caprece, I'd love to call on you if you would talk to us a little bit about the contemporary fashion industry in Baltimore and the contemporary fashion scene and how local designers and producers are innovating to address these questions of sustainability now.
Well, I certainly could take more than the length of the time we have dedicated to this panel discussion. However, I will start by saying post-crash, that was like 2008, and we had the economic implosion. Baltimore's creative class responded to, the loss of jobs and the loss of a capacity for brick and mortar presence. And that's when you saw the rise of mobile, fashion trucks, of which I have to point out that the first one established in Baltimore was 2010 by Stacy Chambers for Go-Go Retreads. And it was interesting, kind of fast forwarding, 2000, is so much to share. But for example, 2014 Stanham, which is the go-to sewing source for the Baltimore area, they had a record year. In fact, they sold out of sewing machines. So people started to connect with actually creating and sort of getting back into small batch, even at that point, small batch manufacturing, kind of home sewing. And then we fast forwarded to sort of like the rallying. There were 4 organizations, fashion industry organizations. I'm going to pull up my notes for just a second here because I want to make sure. Yeah, between 2010 and 2012, we had Wear It Out Baltimore, the Fashion Awards Maryland, the Baltimore Fashion Alliance, and Raw Baltimore. All of these provided much needed platforms for the underground community of Baltimore's fashion community to actually have some presence and be acknowledged. And more than that, they started to collaborate. And because they came together, we came together. I'm in that day too. So anyway, in fact, Wear It Out, I did that from 2011 to 2014, Wear It Out Baltimore. And then we go to, I must say, and I know I'm leading up, but we have 12 schools here in Baltimore that are matriculating either at the certification level or full-blown baccalaureate in some fashion discipline. And I think that should be noted. We have, a junior high school, several high schools. We have Baltimore School of the Arts, Baltimore Design School. We get into BCCC, Stevenson, just to name a few. So that contributed toward what is now emerging as this era of Baltimore's sustainable fashion community. In 2019, I forgot one, but I'll come back to that. 2019, we had, for example, Kenya Miles, who established Baltimore's first natural dye studio and dye garden. And also in 2015, I formed the Fashion Comes to Light Collective, which we produced performance art, staged and live installations of conceptual design that was integrated. That was the curatorial call, that was integrated with low light technologies and kind of alternative fibers, non-traditional, OJ and that kind of thing. And I did those for like a lot of the citywide events, Artscape, and then we had Fashion Comes to Light. And so that kind of brought another dimension, another context into what is emerging presently for this era, which is Baltimore's third, by the way. I don't know whether that will speak to that, but from 1865 to 1929, the crash, we had a wave where Baltimore was seen on the same level as Paris. You had something that had the label Made in Baltimore, you were wearing the top, you were wearing the top. It was comparable to Paris. And lest I get into that, I'm being mindful of my time, and I have 3 more points. Thank you for indulging me. Oh, okay, and then we come to Anthrop 8. So I've been working with a cadre. It's amazing the wealth and breadth of talent that's here underground without, big brick and mortar presence. Basically, they are sustaining and realizing their capacity with the bookends being weddings and proms. You'd be surprised at how much, proms, $800 dresses. My goodness, can you imagine us back in the day? We were good if we got JCPenney's for $79. So anyway, just to say that I've been working with them, all these years for about 10 years now. And so we decided, what happened was I encountered a FIT, I'm an alum of FIT, and I encountered one of my alum mates who presented for Sustainable Fashion Week during this last New York Fashion Week offering. And so she was saying and she is the first upcycling professor for FIT. She was saying she had this vision and she wanted to bring sustainable fashion to the New York Fashion Week schedule. And even though COVID came in and kind of, they shut the school down. So she didn't give up. And on her behalf, I didn't either. And I told her that I wanted to support her programming effort by introducing some of our talent. It was a great success. People had never seen, and it was Anthrop 8. And anthrops are individuals on this planet now during what geologists, refer to as the Anthropocene. And that is this era that is characterized by the fact that humans are controlling the natural resources of our planet. Let's talk about that another time, guys. So what I was thinking is in terms of, we just put it out there and they couldn't believe it was Baltimore, but it was well received, seen all around the world. And so now we're bringing it back to Baltimore on Saturday. And I'm sure that, there's the flyer will speak for itself. And I will, without further ado, thank you. And we'll move forward. And I appreciate this opportunity on behalf of the emerging sustainable fashion community of Baltimore.
Thank you so much for that, Caprece. And I think I love that you're contextualizing this like long trajectory of fashion history in Baltimore, which I think lots of folks don't know about. Janice, I wonder if you would talk to us a little bit about the fashion scene and fashion industry in DC and the connections there with sustainability and sustainable practices.
Good morning, everyone. There really is we're really, for the last couple of years, been trying to just build the community. We found that people in DC really don't have a clue about sustainability. It's really funny how people distance themselves from, they don't realize that they might want the best, but they don't put it into practice. And we found that with fashion designers, we found that with consumers. The DC Sustainable Fashion Collective came out of a group of, it was 4 of us initially, wanted to figure out a way how we could at least start the conversation. So we put on a conference called Unveiling Fashion, which is our moniker is Unveiling Fashion. And we were really surprised by the turnout. It was really well received, and people gave us the push to know that this is so needed in DC and so wanted. Because designers in DC, they don't know anything. They don't have a clue about when they're manufacturing outside of the United States, what's happening, and even if they were working out of LA, that there are issues with people not getting paid properly, people working ridiculous hours and under horrible conditions. They don't have an understanding about fabrics and about textiles and what impact those certain textiles have on the environment. And also, we find that consumers also don't seem to know anything about sustainability, even though they might work in sustainability. We find that people have a disconnect between their own lives and sustainability and how those two things can go together personally. So we thought it was important to start that conversation in DC. We are really trying to get the mayor's office to get on board and join that conversation with us. We had a whole set of programming planned for this year, and COVID came in and said, no, y'all not doing that. So we have to, just like everyone else. So next year we're hoping to put on, we had to cancel our conference. So next year we're hoping to go back to putting on the conference. We also do something for Fashion Revolution Week. And we're also planning to start having smaller conversations throughout the year to focus on sustainability and various issues underneath that subject.
Great, thank you so much. And I think the work that both you, Janice, and Caprece are doing on the ground speaks to the significance of the local and making locally and making in small quantities and making in a kind of mindful way. Valeska, I'd love it if you would tell us a bit. Caprece touched on the Natural Dye Project that you're involved with, but I'd love if we would tell us some more about that project.
Glad to, thank you. I really am just a representative of that project because it involves so many wonderful people that I get the privilege to work with. And so in 2018, the Department of Commerce approached MICA about this idea about starting a natural dye cultivation project here in Baltimore, and looking at the potential design and art and economic benefits of a project like that. And I could talk about that for many hours, but to keep it kind of brief, the general arc of the project has been that Parks and People Foundation became our partner in that project, and that Kenya Miles, Sun English, and Rosa Chang worked with Parks and People to develop a farm on the site. You can see that image on the left-hand side. And in addition, Rosa Chang and Kenya Miles also started a natural dye garden at Hidden Harvest Farm, which is in central Baltimore in Greenmount West, and have been working there with all kinds of community members, members of our MICA community, a lot of our students, to grow a number of different natural dye plants. And if you advance the slides, you can see some of our funding partners that were really central to the project. I really want to acknowledge that because I think when speaking about a project like that, you know, the funding is really key, and I want to speak to that today because for projects like this to continue, for the numbers of people to be involved, to be able to work on a project like this, the funding is really necessary. And we've been trying to be really transparent and responsible about the funding by engaging a lot of community partners in this work. And Caprece is just one of those many people, as well as many designers. So if you go to the next slide, what you'll see is these are images from Rosa Chang, who has really is one of our artists in residence at MICA, and is also one of the coordinating members of the team, sort of moving between Maryland State Arts Council and Parks and People Foundation and MICA, and really focused on the growing of Polygonum tinctorum, which is a traditional dye plant grown throughout most of Asia because of the climatic similarities to Baltimore. And here are just some images early on in the season of the Japanese indigo, and then the water extraction process required for cultivating, for removing the pigment from the dye. From the plant. And if you advance another slide, Vicki, thank you so much. These are some other plants that we grew. Rudbeckia, black-eyed Susans, which is the state flower of Maryland, and also marigolds, which yield a really beautiful yellow. And if you advance again. So there are different components of the curricular work at MICA. We offered multiple classes through which we engaged both artists in residence like Kibibi Ajanku, Kenya Miles, and Rosa Chang, as well as a number of designers who you'll see pictured in some of the upcoming images, and also a number of educational community programs. And I think that as an educator, one of the things I reflect a lot on is how do we engage people in a kind of tactile experience? I think to Janice's point, you know, people don't necessarily think about the materials that they're wearing on their bodies or the processes used for producing that garment. And I think when someone steps into a dye kitchen and uses dyes, whether those are natural dyes or synthetic dyes, you suddenly become aware not only of the labor involved, but also of the impacts. What are you washing down the drain? How much water are you using? And I think that that kind of visceral and tactile relationship to making is what is really important for personal transformation, at least in my experience. People really start to think differently about how they dress themselves and how they want to move through the world. So you can advance again. So I just wanted to highlight really one of the key features of the curricular work that we did at MICA that was really very rewarding for us, because it really allowed us to work with designers that are here in Baltimore. And again, Caprece was instrumental in identifying some of those local designers. Here being one of them, Sahar Pirzada, who I had seen Caprece wearing clothing by Sahar in the years past. And what we did is in Chrissy Day's class, who's an instructor in the fiber department, we had 5 resident designers who worked with the students over the course of the semester. The students developed a number of ideas, surface designs using natural dyes and natural dye processes. And the designers were then invited to both participate in learning about those processes, but then also in designing garments, and were paid as part of that work. Our hope had been to do a fashion show in the spring of 2020. We all know what happened to all the events that we were planning. And if you advance again, there are some other images of some of the other folks that were involved in that project. Including members of the African American Quilters of Baltimore, Glenda Richardson and Rosalind Robinson. And on the right, we see two of the students that were involved in producing the cloth. So after these samples were made and the designers identified which pieces they were most interested in, the whole class worked together to do a production of that cloth, which the designers were then given to make garments from. If you advance to the next page. And then on the left-hand side, we now see someone who has become well-known. Again, someone who Caprece championed for many, many years, Bishmi Cromarty, who has now moved to Los Angeles after being on Project Runway, who was involved in the project. On the right-hand side, Stacey Stube, who has deep relationships through lineage with Indonesia, and also is really involved in trying to lift up the local manufacturing community, and is a designer for Elsa Fitzgerald, and is looking at samples there on the right-hand side. And if you advance to the next slide, I just wanted to also highlight Ileana Konder. I couldn't find an image of Ileana looking at materials, but Ileana was another one of our resident designers who had moved from New York back to Baltimore, or to the Baltimore region. And then on the right-hand side, and I did add another image, but maybe it's not showing up. I don't know if refreshing your slide presentation would bring it to the fore. Just wanted to draw your attention also to some student work and recent graduate work. Bokum, who's one of our graduates, again, someone who Caprece has really championed as a local designer, who's working with upcycling and with natural dyes. And also another image that I had included is from Abby Franklin, a current senior, who's working with food waste. And I think that to conclude, one of the things I want to reflect on is that there's so many aspects of thinking about sustainable fashion and sustainable textile production. And there it is, there it appears. And when we had these conversations with folks like Botanical Colors, who produce natural dyes and market natural dyes out of Seattle, and work with labels like Eileen Fisher, one of the reflections they consistently had was, there's no way that we could sustainably move all of our production from synthetic to natural dyes. It takes too much land. It's too hard on agriculture. We're already having a hard time making connections for the world's marginalized with access to food. So what about all of those other resources that we have, including food waste, which many of which, like avocado pits and coffee and onion skins, yield beautiful and light fast and wash fast color. And I think are an opportunity for us. We started conversations with the city's, Baltimore City's Office of Sustainability. Again, there's lots of opportunity there for us to expand that. And I'll leave it at that. I think, there's other work, new materials, biomaterials that also folks at MICA are looking at, like Ryan Hoover and Annette Cowenbrick with their students. But this is just a little bit of a light shining on one tiny part of our work, which is with the Baltimore Natural Dye Project. So thank you so much for your attention.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Valeska. This is all such exciting work that's going on in the Baltimore and DC area. I want to start turning, even though I have like a giant list of questions that I could ask you all, I also want to start turning to the questions that are coming in from our audience. And if y'all will put questions you want answered in the question and answer, the Q&A function, I will see them better than the lively discussion that's happening, I know, in the chat. So Taylor Evans asked a question that I think will really help us shift into some other things I wanted to discuss. Taylor says, thank you thank you all for this wonderful discussion. I too often find myself thinking about the multidimensional definition of sustainability. I think many consumers looking to become more sustainable gravitate towards secondhand, thrifting as a synonym for sustainable practices. My question is, how do we expand the discussion to encompass the various elements of sustainability to those who may not understand the depth and breadth of sustainable practice, locally made, ethically sourced, humanitarian-driven production? So I wonder if you all would comment on that and just talk a bit about that idea of the multi-dimensions, the multiple dimensions of what sustainability and fashion and garment production means.
That's a loaded question.
It sure is.
Because there's so many pieces to it. It's really complex. For me, some of the things I believe people can do is start getting themselves educated by following organizations like Fashion Revolution and Ellen MacArthur and Sustainable Brands and the Copenhagen Fashion Summit, where people are talking about all the complexities and trying to bring those things together. If they really want to understand, they can follow Lucy Siegel, who writes for The Guardian. Follow her on Twitter. She is so fierce, and she has been a pioneer for this for more than 30 years. You really just have to start educating yourself about all these different pieces. And I just want to add on a little bit of something to follow up on what Valeska said. Is one of the things I've been talking about till I'm blue in the face is that there is a connection between food and fashion and sustainability. And the fact that those two groups, that the food industry and the fashion industry, are not talking and aren't working together is outrageous to me. Those things are clearly connected because of agriculture, cotton, because of food, and the things that you're saying, Valeska, about how food waste can be used for dyeing and other things. And also all of the technological advances that are coming out using like pineapples and other things to help us become more sustainable. There has to be some connectivity between those two industries. Mm-hmm. So I just think you just have to start Googling and start educating yourself. Once you start Googling, you'll find a bunch of stuff. But you eventually just start following a bunch of organizations and start reading the information. You just have to start educating yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking that, what is really refreshing about this emerging movement is that it's shifting at least the perspective in terms of the way people look at fashion and look at their lifestyles, because it's obliging in a way because of the overconsumption and this amazing unbelievable waste that's being generated around the world. But fashion for the longest seems like it's been viewed as a spectacle, but it's not. It's a livelihood. It's also a way of passing on culture.
Exactly.
And I think that the emphasis, and especially when you think about like small batch versus sort of like Kazillion and these sweatshops, people are underpaid. It's more ethical, more human. And I think that we're going to connect with our humanity. I think we're going to connect with the magic that each of us has when it comes to having our own. We're born with an aesthetic frequency. And a lot of times we don't come into our own to express it because we're dictated to. But I think that, small batch and having something special, having something that's one of a kind is really going to take on a totally refreshing context that connects people with fashion in a different way. It's much healthier.
Yeah, and I'm thinking also too of that historical connection, and I wonder, Allie, if there's some connections you want to make there. I'm thinking of Janice talking about pineapple. I'm thinking about the pineapple fiber dress that I saw at the V&A a few years ago in their beautiful show about natural materials and sustainability in fashion.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely a part of it. And we do have, you can see organic dyes in some of our most beautiful costumes in our collection, or clothing in our collection. And consumers were also just different then. I think that there's a big push for consumers now to more. I mean, even the speed of fashion shows it really is under this pressure to own more. dresses, you would, for example, this dress that you're showing, this is originally made in the 1740s, and then it's passed on to a daughter who uses the dress and remakes it so it's still fashionable. Originally, this dress would have been open in the front and had a stomacher, and the second wear or third, it looks like it's been altered a few times, closes the front, and you can actually see how the fabric is patched in the back to update it so it's on fashion, but these textiles last. This is in 1740s and then remade in the 1780s. These last, and it was an investment. It was, as Caprece was saying, we're investing more. It's like buy less and have it longer. Mm-hmm. So it is a very different culture, and they were just frugal. I think on the next slide, I have an example of, this is a child's dress, and on the inside, it's lined with 5 separate fabrics. So you just use the fabric that was left from your dress to make your child's dress. And you could also wear the dress more than once. There's no need to have, it's not a quantity based, it's a quality based. And I think a lot of that has changed in today's society with fast fashion. And this wasn't just, so this was Civil War era, so you would expect frugality. But if you look at the next slide, this is Frances Folsom Cleveland, president's wife, Grover Cleveland's wife. She was a fashion icon. She is, quote, she's said to be the reason the bustle goes away. She scandalized the nation by showing décolletage. In the left, it's like 1897, this portrait of her. This same dress is now in our collection, and it's remade. You can see that the bodice is different. And this is actually a Baltimore maker. So Caprece mentioned how Baltimore was on the level with New York and with Paris. This is the first lady wearing Lottie Barton of Baltimore. So this is a high-end couture designer that is a Baltimore maker. And she's remade the bodice for this is pigeon-chested now, so we're going toward the turn of the century. And it just shows you that it was completely acceptable to just keep your clothes and take care of them and invest in them. So you spend more, but it lasts longer. You find people raising a hem, changing a shoulder, changing the waist to fit different styles. So reusing garments and keeping them longer. That longevity now, clothes barely last a year, depending on what you purchase. So the waste side of that, if you think about how much clothing gets thrown out now versus then when we have things lasting generation upon generation, it is drastic how much fabric waste and how much clothing waste we produce now in both the production and the consumer side.
Yeah. Oh, please, Caprece, go ahead.
I was thinking about upcycling. That's basically what's trending now. And when you look, just observing your commentary, that is really the same mindset. They just when you say made the changes, that's like upcycling, and breathing in new life according to trend, and also just the integrity of the garment. And I had one other thought, but I forgot. I'll mention it when it comes back to me.
Go ahead, Valeska.
I think one thing I also wanted to reflect on, this, our conversation speaks to the complexity of this issue. I think in some ways it's not dissimilar to the conversation we're having around energy and transforming to a new economy. Because of the history of colonization and imperialism and the way in which our economic system has been structured, there are so many hundreds, thousands of garments of the world that are dependent on the kind of system that we've built. And I think that as we turn our attention away from fast fashion, recognizing the impact that has on garment workers in other parts of the world. And I think that I just want to point to some companies that are really trying to attend to the needs of garment workers around the world that are being exploited by the garment industry, but are also dependent on that as a source of income. And that's oftentimes used as a rationalization for why the practices continue. We're creating jobs. Well, they're not ethical jobs that honor the dignity of people around the world. And so there's lots of examples of companies that are doing that. People Tree is just one example. Safia Mini, who started Fashion Revolution along with some other folks, but also one of our graduates from the fiber department, Rachel Fowler, who started Tonlé, also reflects on that a lot and has actually moved her company to being a collective. She's self-aware around the idea of white saviorism, development work, trying to start relief projects, but also recognizes the need for paid work that honors the dignity of workers and their skill sets. These amazing, like to Caprice's point, there are artistic traditions around the world that have been completely displaced by fast fashion. Adira Eleko in Nigeria is just one that, again, Kibibi Ajanko in our program is focusing on. So companies that are looking at how do we maintain the artistic traditions of peoples around the world, honor the labor, honor the knowledge, honor the expertise, and then shift the conversation around what we're willing to pay for and how long that garment is going to last us and what we think about when we put that on rather than the garment that was, the same cost as a sandwich.
Mm. I did remember what I wanted to the point, and that was there's also an emerging these categories. You've got recycling, upcycling, wearable art, zero waste design, and also categories like vintage curators. I mentioned Stacy Chambers earlier, and we have one great talent, Danny Williams, for Illicit Vintage Rag in the documentary. And when you think about it, it takes a certain gift to sift through vintage. Allison, I would speak to you about that. And because you're looking at fabrics that have lasted 100 years. And then you look at fast fashion, which lasts, 7 washes? Maybe.
If it lasts that long.
If they last that long. So, I think that this trend toward, there she is, to the right is Danielle Williams for Illicit Vintage Rag, one of our star, our star talent that's featured in Anthrop 8. And it's just interesting because she was a teenager and she would go in and she fell in love with vintage and go to school, back in the 90s, late 90s. She's a young thing. And she would go to school. And it's like, she just fell in love with like the weight, the construction, the concept. It just, nothing got her attention like that at the mall. So, I think this is what we're going to be seeing more of too, is once again, a perspective, a mindset that really appreciates fashion for the fine arts medium that it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that every fashion historian that I know at some point goes and starts wearing vintage. And if you like vintage and vintage curation, Alexandra Deutsch, who used to work for the Maryland Center for History and Culture, she's now at Winterthur. But if you follow her on Instagram, it's Volumes of Vintage. And she is doing a love letter to Baltimore Vintage where she has on different vintage sellers and talks about their journey. It's really beautiful and enlightening because the idea of, sometimes you even know the story. So you're like taking on clothing that someone else has worn and looking at it as a positive, a very cool thing. Continuing the story of a garment that you're wearing is just something so cool. Like this is from the 50s and I just love the idea that this dress has lived on and I'm adding to the history of it. As a fashion historian, I look in dresses and I see how seams have moved and I see how people have changed them, to fit their personality, to fit what they want to look like. And the idea that I can do that with clothing is such a cool thing. And I think that if more people, it's not expensive to wear vintage. It's just a matter of going out and getting those resources as a means of sustainable fashion.
One of the things that I think is really, really important is that people need to start in their own closet. Like I preach this every chance I get. You need to take responsibility for yourself first before you go out and try to change the whole world. And people need to go in their own closets and really start making some real hard choices about the things you really, really love and the things that you don't love so much. And I think once we start looking at ourselves and our own behavior, then it makes it easier. I think I said this before, it makes it easier for you to start working outward. Once you realize that you have a bunch of stuff that you're not wearing, and then you need to understand how to responsibly dispose of those things, then I think your attitude starts to change, because when you pull everything out of your closet and put it all in one room, like the Marie Kondo way, you start to realize very quickly how wasteful you are as a person. And until you start to change your own mentality about your own life, then you'll be able to take some of this other stuff in and start and be able to move towards helping on a larger scale. But you really have to start with yourself first.
Yeah, I want to draw a few questions I'm seeing coming up together, including one that was a question that was raised in my mind. Kelly Greenwald wrote, "I fully support upcycle, recycle, vintage, but as a woman who wears plus, it's extremely difficult to find good items in larger size. I also wear a larger size, and vintage just has really been a non-starter for me." And we had another question about just doesn't sustainability go hand in hand with quality and cost? And so one of the things that's bringing to my mind is this question of accessibility, who has access to making these kinds of choices on an individual level, and how is the industry responding to those kinds of questions of accessibility? If y'all have thoughts about that.
I have a thought to share with regard to Kelly Greenwald. Another trend that's refreshing are these numerous movements that are afoot.
Oh no, we've lost Caprece. Well, does anyone else have an answer while we hope that Caprece rejoins us?
The one thing about spending a good amount of money on your clothing is when you're investing in clothing that has been well made, is that they last. Your clothes last. That's really the important thing. And also that I think there's this myth around that that clothing made by sustainable designers is expensive. That's not true. There are designers who are working to try to minimize costs at the same time implementing sustainable practices. But you have to understand that because the industry and all the big boys aren't participating as much as they should be, that is one of the reasons why their cost is so high. Until they all jump on board, until H&M gets their act together, and all of the like brands get their act, the Gap and all of that, until they get their act together and really fully participate in sustainability, then you'll see the prices start coming down, and it'll come down all the way down so that the consumer can participate in a way that could be economical for them.
Yeah, and I think sort of looking back to history and thinking about the ways that garments used to be these very valuable pieces of people's what they owned, their what they had and what they passed down, is another, I think, kind of inspiring element. And some of the few vintage pieces I do have are actually my mom's, and jewelry and things like that. So that kind of passing down, I think, is a great way that we can kind of engage in this, as Janice is suggesting, until the mainstream industry kind of catches up. Now we've got Caprece back.
Yeah, I went in and out a couple times there. But my point was, what was my point? My point was, these movements, because you've got the plus size, you've got trans, you've got 50 plus, 60 plus. We're sort of like, saying we've had enough of being dictated to by the industry, and we're going to establish or, kind of be lead our own selves in terms of developing standards moving forward. And I think that when it comes to like plus size, that's where upcycling comes in, because you're able to actually manipulate an existing garment in a way that it can be whatever it is that you want it to be, as long as there's some conceptual perspective in terms of redoing it, however, like with the plus size, you can add, more fabric. You can, do different things with details that are more flattering than perhaps the original garment rather was for your particular body type. So that was the point I wanted to make.
I hate to stop this conversation. I think we could go on much longer than an hour, and hopefully someday we'll be able to all get together and have a part 2, which would just be wonderful. But we are at 1 o'clock. I want to thank all of you, Vicki for moderating, Valeska, Janice, Ali, and Caprece. Thank you so much for your time and your participation in this conversation. I think many of us in the audience are going to do exactly what Janice suggested, and start to work on our own closets and move out from there. I think that's great advice and something that's really manageable to start with. thanks to everybody who attended our fashion symposium the last 3 days. I hope you found it meaningful and informative. Again, we're really grateful to be part of this fashion community, and we're going to be sharing a whole slew of resources that were put into the chat today. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with recordings to all of these programs, in addition to extra resources for you to learn more about all of the topics that we discussed. I just want to make one quick plug. These programs are made possible by members who are so valuable to us. And so if you like to consider becoming a member, I urge you to look at our website, mdhistory.org, and think about joining as a member. Your membership comes with some benefits, but really it allows us to continue free programming just like this. Finally, please visit Spectrum of Fashion through the end of the year. You can make a reservation online. We have reduced capacity and timed ticketing to make your visit to the museum safe. So please check that out. And thanks so much again to everybody. Be safe, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you all so much.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.
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 Bye. Take care.